Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Murder Makes Waves, Jack and Francis Mysteries, Book 3 by Carmen Radtke, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, November 1931. The hand caressed the small bottle like a cherished friend. It had been a while since its last appearance in a little play staged in the cause of fairness. Now the arsenic would be a welcome travel companion. There were too many rats lurking around wherever one looked, no matter how many legs they had. The ship horn's blast pierced the early morning silence of Port Adelaide. Francis Palmer's hand slipped into Uncle Sal's as they turned a corner and caught their first sight of the SS Empress of the Sea. The gleaming white ship dwarfed the tugboats on the next pier. Tiny figures swarmed over the deck. The gangway was lowered, ready for the first passengers to come aboard. Francis wondered how many people would travel with them. The ocean liner appeared big enough to house a small town. Her head whirred as they moved closer. It seemed incredible that for the next 6 weeks or so this would be their home, and 23-year-old Francis Palmer, who'd never been further than Melbourne, would travel halfway round the world to London. Uncle Sal, who in his glory days as vaudeville artist Salvatore the Magnificent had played the stages in a dozen countries, eyed the ship with admiration. "That's a sweet berth we're sailing on," he said. "See the elegant lines, with the sheer curve of the hull and that rounded stern? And did you notice how the funnel is placed directly between the two masts?" "She is a beaut," Francis agreed, despite her lack of nautical knowledge. "She's fast, too," a low voice behind her said. "Jack." Francis spun around to find herself enveloped in the arms of Jack Sullivan, owner of the Top Note, Adelaide's finest nightclub. And, although she had to pinch herself to believe it, he was her fiancé and the reason they were here. Jack's mother in England had begged him to come to her aid for some unspecified reason, and he'd invited Francis and Uncle Sal to come along. They'd work off their passage as Salvatore the Magnificent and his plucky assistant, Signorina Francesca, although Francis had her suspicions that being part of the ship's entertainment would not cover all their expenses. It would be churlish to probe. This was Uncle Sal's and her dream to perform together. Uncle Sal's proper career had ended with a car accident that left him with a gammy ankle, and Francis worked as a telephone exchange operator to support herself, her mother, and Uncle Sal. He was her godfather, not her real uncle, and apart from Jack, the most sophisticated and lovable man she'd ever met. He never complained about the change in his circumstances or the hardship the Great Depression meant for everyone. For now, though, the lack of money in people's pockets allowed Frances to leave her employment for 6 months. When they returned to Adelaide, her boss had promised she could come back to her switchboard. In her absence, instead of employing a new girl, the other operators would divide up her hours between them. Jack pushed a lock out of Frances's eyes. "Ready?" His gaze flickered to her trunk. It was half empty, despite holding all her presentable clothes. With only a few days' notice, there had been no time to go shopping. If Frances was honest, she also didn't want to spend any of her hard-earned shillings on clothes that might seem fashionable in South Australia but be considered dowdy in London. England. Her heart drummed against her ribs. She'd be in London for a winter Christmas and all the magic that entailed. She wished her mother were here, to see Francis step onto the gleaming gangway with its handrails shining so white they reflected the summer sun. But then Francis would have felt obliged to stay home, whereas now she was free of any obligation. Her mother was happy up in Queensland, helping her son and daughter-in-law preparing for the birth of their second child. An elegant young couple stepped out of one of the buildings where passengers could wait. The woman had a fur stole around her shoulders, despite the day already heating up. Her hair shone black like a magpie's wing, and her dress could have come straight out of a fashion magazine. Her dapper companion was dressed all in white. He took her arm as she stalked away on her high heels. Behind them followed an older woman with a fur coat slung around her shoulders. Her dark hair showed no traces of silver. Francis suspected an expensive hairdresser deserved the credit for that. 3 porters struggled in their wake, lugging trunks and carpet-bags. Frances glanced at her own outfit of green skirt and yellow jumper. Maybe she should have dressed up too. Uncle Sal's suit had shiny patches, but his posture would always be dignified. As for Jack, he looked perfectly at ease in his flannels, shirt, and lightweight blazer. "Is it going to be all elegant folks?" she asked. "Not likely," Jack said. "You meet all kinds of people on these voyages, and don't forget, being rich doesn't make them any better than anyone else, only less likely to worry about their bills." He signaled a couple of porters to pick up their luggage. "Shall we?" Frances slipped her arm through Jack and Uncle Sal's. "I'm ready for anything." They strolled up the gangway at an easy pace. Frances would have loved to have raced aboard, but it would have been embarrassing to behave childishly in public view, and she didn't want Uncle Sal to make a wrong step. She broke into a huge smile she couldn't stop. Neither did she want to. What did it matter if other people realized that she wasn't used to adventures like this? Jack's top note was a classy joint, but the Empress of the Sea oozed money and an old-world elegance born of centuries of knowing the Empire's place in the world. Australia couldn't compete with that. Clacking high heels and giggles behind them announced more arrivals. "Excuse me," a high-pitched soprano said behind Frances. She obliged and let go of Jack's arm as she stepped as close to the handrail as possible. 3 young women in fashionable dresses rushed past, leaving behind a trail of too sweet perfume. "They must be part of the crew," Uncle Sal said knowingly as he cast an expert eye over the trio, who now rushed past a man in uniform. "They are very smart," Frances suppressed a little sigh. "Not as smart as you," Jack said. "They probably meant to impress the few locals out and about at this hour." He grinned at Frances as he fished a thick envelope with their tickets out of his pocket. "Good morning, sir." The uniformed man clicked his heels together and took the papers. "Mr. Sullivan, Miss Palmer, Mr. Bernardo, if you'll follow the stewards to your cabins." "Thanks," Jack said, but the man already switched his attention to the next passenger, a dowager-like lady with a nervous corgi in her arms and a mild-mannered young man at her heels. Inside the ship was at least as impressive as from the outside. Thick blue carpet muffled their steps, and the wood gleamed in the light from the glass-domed wall lamps. The porters led them down a flight of stairs that forked off into 2 directions. They took the left passage, which was flanked by cabin doors. The first steward, carrying Frances's trunk, stopped outside cabin number 107. He unlocked it and stepped aside to allow Frances to enter. "We'll see you in 10 minutes on the promenade deck," Jack said, as he and Uncle Sal were led further down the passage. A huge weight dropped off Frances's shoulders as she saw how neat yet small her cabin was. It consisted of a bed, with a trundle bed underneath, a small table, 2 chairs, a dresser with mirror, and a small inbuilt wardrobe. A door led to a snug bathroom she had to share with the cabin next door. "Everything all right, miss?" the steward asked as he showed her around. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down, and he could be no more than 17 or 18, she estimated. "It's lovely," she said. "If you could tell me how to find the promenade deck, I'll leave you to your job." He opened the dresser drawer and handed her a stiff, gilt-edged brochure. "Here's a map of the Empress, miss. For the promenade deck, you just follow the passage to the staircase on the starboard side." Frances gave him a blank stare. "That's the left side," he said. "Then you go up 3 flights, and you can't miss it." He saluted and left her. She would unpack later, she decided. For now, a quick brush would have to do if she wanted to be punctual. As she made her way to the promenade deck, brisk stewards and stewardesses hurried past. Low voices behind the cabin doors reminded her of the fact that she'd spent the voyage in the company of hundreds of travelers, people who might see Frances Palmer during the day without having any inkling that the ravishing blonde-wigged Signorina Francesca, who'd perform her act as Salvatore the Magnificent's assistant 2 nights a week, was the same person. She chuckled. This was heaven. Chapter 2. Jack slipped the lanky boy a 10-shilling note as soon as he had deposited the trunk and carpet bag. The boy grinned so wide his face almost split. "I'll come back and unpack for you later, sir." "That's not necessary, but thank you." "The name is Sam, sir, in case you need anything." Judging from his odd tone, the second-class passengers probably didn't dip too freely into their pockets, At least not at the start of a journey when it made most sense to make friends with the people responsible for your comfort. "Have you been at sea long?" Jack asked. "It's my second voyage. My uncle's looking after the real toffs in first class." The boy broke off, panic in his eyes. "Sorry, sir, I meant no disrespect." "No harm done. Don't let me keep you." 2 knocks on the inside door of their shared bathroom told Jack that Uncle Sal was ready to go up to the promenade deck. They arrived a minute before Francis. The first passengers already set up, claiming their spots on the deck chairs, which were lined up with a good view of the sea, or in this case, the pier. The whole promenade deck was covered by a glass roof, and heaters would no doubt make it a pleasant place when they reached the cold parts of the world. Glass tubes led all the way up to the roof and down into the bowels of the ship, sending the daylight into the lower decks, an ingenious system that to Frances was the most ingenious thing she'd ever seen. "Shall we stroll around?" Jack asked Frances. "You two enjoy yourself," Uncle Sal said. "I'll stick to one of these chairs for a bit. Never had those before on my travels." "It's a bit fancier than my last ocean voyage," Jack agreed. He'd volunteered as soon as the Great War broke out and returned to Australia on one of the first troop ships back home in January 1919. "She's a corker, all right." Uncle Sal lowered himself onto a deck chair and tilted his face up to the sun. Frances stood transfixed. Outside, a group of people dressed like Hollywood stars were trailed by a gaggle of what must be maids and manservants laden with baggage. A few steps behind them came porters with yet more trunks. Jack was impressed, too. He whistled through his teeth. "Phew. Seems like all the nabobs in the whole of Australia are here in Adelaide." "Pardon me." Frances felt herself nudged aside as a tall young man with pomaded hair strode past, with a dog they'd spotted earlier straining on his leash. The bejeweled collar sparkled like a Christmas tree. The young man gave her an apologetic smile. "Tinker Bell here needs a spot of privacy." His British accent made Frances curious. Sure enough, most of the smart passengers she'd noticed so far appeared too well-groomed and rich for Adelaide, which, as much as she loved it, was still only a small outpost in a country removed from almost everything. But she'd expected their fellow travelers to be mostly Australians, setting off from Sydney and Melbourne, or New Zealanders. The Empress of the Sea had originally embarked from Littleton, and they'd stopped in Colombo and Bombay before they reached London. The names alone made Frances's heart ache with longing to see them. If the weather caused no big delays, they should have a whole day to explore each city. "Would you like a refreshment? I'm thirsty." Jack touched her back. "If the bars are already open." As if on cue, a waiter with a tray held high in his hands came through the doors at the end of the promenade deck. A graying man regally snapped his fingers at the waiter, who hurried over to serve him and his companion. Both men had aquiline features and bushy eyebrows, so Frances took them to be brothers. Jack approached the waiter. "Is it possible to find tea or lemonade somewhere?" The graying man gave him a contemptuous glare. Jack ignored it. "The bar in the restaurant 1 flight down is open," the waiter said. The other amenities will only be available from noon onward." "I'll join you." Uncle Sal nimbly climbed out of the chair. Frances heard the man mutter to his brother. "Those are the nightclub folks," as they followed Uncle Sal and Jack with a haughty stare. She lifted her chin higher. Jack, who employed as many of the soldiers who'd served under his command as he could afford, and who supported soup kitchens and orphanages, was worth a lot more than these jokers would ever be. The same went for Uncle Sal. And the top note was a place to be proud of. It gave people joy and happiness, and it fed the staff and everyone else remotely involved with it. "All alone? You're much too pretty for that." A portly middle-aged man moved close enough to brush her elbow. She inched away. His hair pomade smelt cloying, and his breath stank of cigar smoke. "I'm waiting for my uncle and my fiancé," she said, hoping he'd get the hint. His gaze flickered to her ringless fingers. For once, she cursed herself for keeping her engagement ring safe in her trunk. She didn't want to risk losing it when she had to take it off for her rehearsals, or worse, tempting a loose-fingered person. She might come from a law-abiding family, but her uncle in Melbourne was a policeman, and since meeting Jack, she'd had more than her share of risky adventures. The portly man inched closer. Slowly but firmly she trod on his foot. He yelped and moved away. "Everything all right?" Trust Jack to appear in the right moment. "Absolutely." She took the lemonade he handed her. "I'd raise a glass to our voyage, but not with that stuff," he said. They left Uncle Sal swilling his beer and reading the newspaper and explored the ship. There were a few rooms only open for the first-class passengers. If the rest was anything to go by, they must be palatial, Frances thought. The library alone with its reading tables and thick carpets reminded her of a glossy magazine. The shelves were stacked with enough books to keep the keenest reader happy for a lifetime. Hidden from her sight inside the writing room, a man said, "I've made a mistake. You must believe me." The voice had a theatrical tremolo. Frances wondered if they'd stumbled into an impromptu rehearsal as Jack led her away to give whoever it was privacy. The next room pulled a much bigger crowd than the deserted library. Ice cubes clanked in 2 cocktail shakers, and a slim bartender in a white uniform studded with brass buttons added splashes of liquor in all colors of the rainbow. The first drink went to the dowager-like lady Frances had spotted earlier. "A monkey gland for Madame," the bartender said. The orange-red cocktail shimmered in its glass. Frances eyed it appreciatively. She rarely touched liquor, but this one smelt heavenly of orange juice and grenadine, and she liked the name. Madame inhaled the aroma before she took a tiny sip. The small dog shot yapping into the room, dragging the sheepish-looking young man behind her. Tinkerbell promptly squatted on his haunches and gazed at his owner. "Sorry, Aunt Mildred." The young man mopped his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. Tink got a bit upset with all the strangers around. He signaled the bartender for another monkey gland. "One moment, sir." The bartender prepared more drinks for a group of young men who lounged in a group of armchairs covered on a brown leather. Sidecars for Mr. Sanders and Mr. Fitch, gin rickeys for Mr. Callahan and Mr. Brown. He addressed Jack as he mixed the monkey gland. "What can I do for you, sir and madame?" "One moment," Aunt Mildred said. "My nephew will have plain soda water." A dangerous glint came into her eyes. "Won't you, Tommy? Drinking alcohol before the cocktail hour is a ruinous habit in a young man, and I will not support it." She patted her dog's head as she reached for her glass. The young men snickered as Tommy humbly accepted his soda water. "We'll have soda as well," Jack said. "You don't look like a teetotaler," Mr. Fitch, who sported a too bright yellow waistcoat and a thin mustache that could not divert from his weak chin, sneered at Jack. Jack ignored him. Aunt Mildred fumbled for the pince-nez attached to her jacket by a thin golden chain and inspected Jack. Tinkerbell sidled up to him and rubbed herself against Jack's leg. "You appear to be a sensible man," she said, "and my dog approves of you. Tinkerbell is never wrong." "I try." Jack's expression was solemn. "I wish I could say the same about most of the young generation." Tommy opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it. Frances felt a surge of pity for him. He must be at least 27, she thought, and despite his round face and pink cheeks, he looked like a rugby player, not someone who cowered before a relative. Unless, of course, she held the purse strings. "Not the sense God gave a goose." Aunt Mildred emptied her cocktail. "Mind you, my dear late brother was as bad, a pretty face, a sad story," and he'd open his pocketbook. "I say, Aunt Mildred," Tommy loosened his suddenly too tight collar. "Shush, my boy. You're lucky your mother made up for your father's failings." She spoke to Jack again without bothering to include Frances. Maybe she hadn't seen her, Frances thought charitably. The dim light in the cocktail bar and the obvious nearsightedness of Aunt Mildred would explain that. "I won't ask you to keep an eye on my boy, but—" The young men now snickered openly. She quelled them with one glance. "At least my nephew is worth caring about, which is obviously more than can be said about you lot. Bright young things. Good riddance to that." "Hold it!" Mr. Fitch's already flushed face grew redder. Mr. Brown, a reedy youngster with a signet ring and protruding teeth, put a calming hand on Mr. Fitch's shoulder. "Leave the old bird alone and let's have another drink." Aunt Mildred harumphed, swept up Tinkerbell in her arms, and sailed out of the room, Tommy in her wake. "What are you staring at?" asked Mr. Fitch of nobody in particular. Frances had finished her soda water. Giving the bartender a sympathetic shrug, she signaled to Jack she was ready to go. The doors to the ballroom where they'd perform were still closed, but they found Tommy gazing at it longingly. His redoubtable aunt was nowhere in sight. Only Tinkerbell could be heard yapping away in the powder room further down the passage. Tommy spun around as he heard them nearing. He seemed to be awfully nervy, Frances thought, although his open face and admiring glance endeared him to her. "Awfully sorry about the scene in the bar," he said. "My Aunt Mildred is an awful good sort once you get to know her better." "No worries." Jack held out his hand. "Jack Sullivan, and this is my fiancée, Miss Palmer." Tommy shook Jack's hand with abandon. "She's not usually taking to the giggle water this early, only before we're going out to sea. It calms her insides." "I'm not judging," Jack said. "Before you ask, I'm not a wowser either. I only prefer to wait until the sun's over the yardarm." Right. Tommy ruffled his hair. "I'm forgetting my manners. Tommy Clifton." From inside the ballroom came soft voices. They're cleaning up," Tommy said. "Have you had a peek inside yet?" "We only came aboard this morning," Frances said, "but I've seen pictures." "We saw you, didn't we, when we returned to the ship? Aunt Mildred likes to spend a night on the town when we can." "You stayed in Adelaide overnight. Anywhere special?" Frances asked. Tommy craned his neck toward the powder room and lowered his voice. "The Grosvenor Hotel. Not a bad old place." "Not a bad old place." Frances had to stop her jaw from dropping. The 4-story hotel on North Terrace with its marble facade attracted only the wealthiest of guests. "Not much of a night on the town," Jack said. Tommy's pink cheeks went a little redder. "When Auntie was asleep, I went for a stroll and found a smashing little place. The top note, that singer they have," he broke off as if only now remembering Frances. "Have you been there?" "Oh, yeah." Frances gave a little shrug. "Not a bad old place, eh, Jack?" "I've seen worse." Jack gave her a wink. "I assume you don't want anyone else to know." "Know what?" Aunt Mildred and Tinker Bell were surprisingly light on their feet. Tommy gave a start. His eyes bulged. "That your nephew enjoyed his stay in our fair city very much. It wouldn't endear him to the Sydneysiders or the Melbourneians on this ship." Jack flashed her a disarming smile. Aunt Mildred snorted. "We're not in the business of endearing ourselves to people." "I thought so. We'll see you two later," Jack chuckled to himself as they left their new acquaintances behind. A shudder ran through the ship as the engine started. The horn blasted. "We're ready to leave port," Jack said. "Shall we wave Adelaide farewell from the observation deck?"